My name is Daniel, and I am 68 years old. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story. It's a warning, a confession, and maybe even a lesson for anyone who's ever felt erased in their own home. It began on a Sunday evening, the kind of night that should have been warm with comfort. The table was set, the roast still steaming, glasses half full of wine. To anyone else looking in, it would have seemed like a picture-perfect family dinner, the kind people post online with captions about blessings and togetherness. But behind those smiles and clinks of silverware, the truth was colder. She said it, without hesitation, without shame. My daughter-in-law's voice sliced through the air, sharp and final. "You're just a freeloader here." The word didn't echo. It didn't need to. It landed like a heavy stone. One word, and the entire room shifted. My fork slipped against the plate, the scrape louder than it should have been. My son, my only son, sat across from me, but he didn't look up. He didn't defend me. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he swirled the wine in his glass, watching the red liquid spin as though it could drown the moment. And I stayed quiet. Not because I was weak. Not because I had nothing to say. But because sometimes silence weighs more than shouting ever could. The room thickened with discomfort. The scrape of a knife against porcelain, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, all of it felt like judgment. I could feel my pulse in my temple, steady but heavy, like a drumbeat inside my skull. Outwardly, though, I showed nothing. My face stayed impassive, my hands steady. Melissa, my daughter-in-law, shifted in her chair, her lips curling into a smile. Not the kind that came from joy, but the kind that came from victory. She knew exactly what she had done. She thought my silence meant surrender. Daniel, my son, finally lifted his eyes to meet mine for a brief second. There was no apology there, no shame. Just the hollow look of a man too tired or too cowardly to stand up for his own father. That look cut deeper than Melissa's words ever could. I laid my fork down gently. The soft clink on the plate echoed across the table like a verdict. Then I spoke, calm and measured. "Excuse me." No one moved as I pushed my chair back. No one stopped me when I walked out onto the porch. The air outside was cooler than I expected, carrying the faint smell of rain. I slipped a hand into my vest pocket and pulled out the old silver watch my father gave me when I turned 18. Its surface was scratched, its ticking steady. He had told me then, "Keep time, but don't let time keep you." Standing on the porch of the house I had built with my own two hands, with my own savings and sacrifices, I replayed her words in my head. Freeloader. She had spat it at me in the very place I had poured decades of labor into. The home that existed only because I had kept it standing through years of sweat and sacrifice. Melissa thought she had won. Daniel thought staying silent would protect him from choosing sides. They were both wrong. They mistook my silence for weakness when really it was something else entirely. It was a pause, a choice, a gathering of strength. Because silence has two sides, it can be surrender, or it can be preparation. And that night, as I stood on that porch with the watch ticking in my hand, I decided exactly what my silence would mean. Not weakness. Preparation. When people hear the word silence, they often confuse it with defeat. They think quietness is the absence of power, that if you don't fight back with words or fists, you've given up. But I learned long ago that silence can be the sharpest weapon in the room. I didn't stay quiet at that dinner table because I was afraid of Melissa. I didn't stay quiet because Daniel's lack of support broke me. I stayed quiet because silence does something words cannot. It unsettles. It lingers. It forces people to hear themselves and live with the echo of what they said. As a younger man, I used to argue. In the army, on the factory floor, even with my late wife when we disagreed, my instinct was to fight back right away. To raise my voice, to make my point known. But life teaches you. Shouting rarely changes a mind. All it does is exhaust the throat. Silence, though, silence breeds thought. Silence lets others reveal themselves. When Melissa called me a freeloader, I could have listed every sacrifice I'd made. I could have reminded her of the mortgage payments I covered when Daniel was unemployed, the roof repairs I paid for, the meals I provided when their fridge was bare. But if I had, she would have only twisted my words, turned my defense into more ammunition. Instead, I gave her nothing. No reaction, no defense, no validation. Just silence. And in that silence, she smiled, not because she had won, but because she thought she had. That was her mistake. You see, silence is not always a retreat. Sometimes it's a wall. Sometimes it's a mirror. Sometimes it's the space where plans are born. That night, as I stood on the porch with my father's watch in hand, I let silence do its work. Inside, they went on eating, laughing, pretending as if I were already invisible. And that was fine. Let them. Because silence also buys time, and time is where true power grows. Every insult I had swallowed over the years, every dismissive remark Melissa whispered under her breath, every moment Daniel chose not to defend me, they thought my silence meant I didn't notice. They thought it meant I accepted it. But silence has memory. And memory has weight. When you hold your tongue long enough, you start to see the pattern others try to hide. You catch the way Melissa's comments weren't slips of the tongue but deliberate steps, each one moving closer to erasing me from the home I built. You notice the way Daniel's eyes didn't just wander out of distraction but out of guilt, out of a slow surrender to her influence. Silence gave me clarity. It showed me not just the sting of their betrayal, but the shape of their plan. And when you see the shape of your enemy's plan, you don't need to shout to fight back. You need to wait. You need to prepare. You need to make sure that when you do break your silence, your words carry the weight of truth, not just noise. That's why I didn't explode that night. That's why I didn't demand apologies or storm out forever. Because silence was never my weakness. It was my weapon. And every tick of that old pocket watch reminded me, patience is power. Melissa thought my silence meant she had won. Daniel thought it meant I was fading away. But what they didn't realize was that silence was my opening move. And the game had only just begun. When Melissa's words stung through that dining room, freeloader, they didn't just insult me in the present. They reached backward, clawing at decades of sacrifice, as if all of it meant nothing. I sat on the porch that night, holding my father's pocket watch, and memories began to surface. Some memories you choose to recall. Others force themselves on you whether you want them or not. These came rushing, heavy and sharp. I remembered the day Daniel was born. The hospital was small, the air thick with disinfectant, the hallway buzzing with nurses moving quickly. But the moment they placed him in my arms, the world went quiet. His tiny hand wrapped around my finger, and in that instant, I swore a vow my son would never go without. Not food, not shelter, not love. Whatever it cost me, he would have the life I never did. That vow became the compass of my life. When he was still small, barely 4, I was working double shifts at the mill. Some nights I came home too tired to eat. But no matter how heavy my body felt, if he wanted me to read him a bedtime story, I read it. If he wanted to play catch in the yard before the sun went down, I found the strength. His laugh, loud, unguarded, was more fuel than any paycheck. When he turned 10, he was scared of thunderstorms. He'd cling to my leg whenever thunder cracked. I remember crouching down, holding him close, telling him, "Storms pass, son. They always do. And while they're here, I'll never leave you alone in them." His wide, trusting eyes believed me, and that belief kept me going through storms of my own. Years passed, and every dollar I earned seemed to vanish into bills, school clothes, groceries, mortgage payments. My back ached, my hands hardened into calluses, but I didn't complain. Because every time I looked at him, I knew it was worth it. When he reached 18, I passed down the pocket watch my father had once given me. I remember that day as clearly as if it had just happened. He turned it over in his hands, his eyes wide, his smile bright. "I'll make you proud, Dad," he said. And in that moment, I thought I already was. So how did that boy become the man who sat in silence while his wife called me a burden? I thought of the years when Daniel struggled. His first year of marriage to Melissa, he lost his job. Bills piled up. Eviction notices threatened their future. And who stepped in? I did. I paid their mortgage. I covered their groceries. I made sure they never saw the kind of hunger I had grown up with. I never asked for repayment. I never even reminded him later. That's what fathers do. We carry the weight so our children don't have to. But memory is cruel. It doesn't ask permission. It shows you every detail, both the warmth and the wounds. I remembered one Thanksgiving, long after Melissa had married into the family. Daniel asked me to carve the turkey, just like I always had. He smiled, but his eyes told a different story. They wandered when I spoke, as if my words were background noise. Melissa stood at his side, whispering in his ear, smirking whenever I reached for the carving knife. It was a small moment, but even then, I felt something shifting. The boy who once slipped little notes into my lunchbox saying, "I love you, Dad," was fading. The roast on the table that Sunday night wasn't the first meal I'd paid for, not by a long shot. Yet, there she was, calling me a freeloader, as though I had been nothing but a shadow, draining their resources. Every sacrifice blurred together in my mind. Nights without sleep, mornings spent working when my body screamed for rest. Decades of building a home that they now acted as if was theirs to claim. And still, I stayed quiet. Because anger is loud, but truth doesn't need volume. The truth was that Daniel would never have had that roof over his head without me. Melissa would never have had the comfort of that home without my sweat and blood. And if they both had forgotten, well, memory hadn't. That pocket watch in my hand ticked steadily, each sound a reminder that time doesn't erase sacrifice. It exposes it. It forces it back into the light when people try to bury it under lies. Melissa wanted to paint me as useless. Daniel wanted to pretend silence was neutrality. But my silence was different. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't weakness. It was the slow gathering of all those years of sacrifice into something sharper, stronger. Because when you've carried a family your entire life, you don't just vanish with one insult. You don't crumble because someone younger calls you a burden. No, you wait. You gather. You remember. And then, when the time is right, you remind them of exactly who you are. Betrayal doesn't usually come in one blow. It starts small, disguised as something harmless, almost invisible. A look, a word, a comment slipped in with a smile. And if you're not paying attention, it grows until it's wrapped around you like vines, choking you without warning. With Melissa, the signs had been there from the beginning. I remembered the first time Daniel brought her home. She seemed sweet enough. Bright eyes, polite manners, quick to offer help with the dishes. I told myself he was lucky, that she'd take care of him. I wanted to believe it. Maybe I even needed to believe it. After losing my wife, all I wanted was to see my son find happiness. But sweetness can sour fast. The first cracks showed in little remarks. When she thought I couldn't hear, she'd comment about the old recliner in the living room. "That thing belongs in the trash." She'd sigh about the news being too loud when I turned on the television. Or she'd mention how high the utility bills had climbed since I moved in. Each word, by itself, was nothing. But together, they were a pattern, deliberate and steady. And Daniel? He stayed quiet. Maybe at first, he thought silence was easier than conflict. Maybe he thought ignoring it would make it go away. But silence, when repeated, isn't neutrality. It's agreement. And little by little, his silence became her permission. I noticed how the conversations in the house shifted. When I walked into the room, voices dropped, subjects changed. When bills came in the mail, Melissa snatched them up before I could see. When talk of our home slipped into her sentences, Daniel didn't correct her. That Sunday dinner wasn't the beginning. It was only the first time the mask slipped completely. By then, the roots of betrayal had already taken hold. The truth is, Melissa never just wanted Daniel. She wanted control. Control of the house, of the finances, of the narrative she spun about me being a burden. And she played the long game. With every complaint, every whispered remark, every late-night conversation behind closed doors, she was building a case. Not in court, but in Daniel's mind, and in the eyes of anyone who would listen. And not because I didn't see it, but because I wanted to be sure. Betrayal isn't always obvious. Sometimes what looks like betrayal is just immaturity or stress or fear. But this was calculated. She wanted me out, piece by piece, until I was nothing more than a ghost in the home I built. When Daniel stopped meeting my eyes during conversations, when he started asking me questions that sounded more like accusations, I knew the seed had grown roots. Melissa had watered it carefully, and Daniel had let it sprout. Still, I didn't speak. I didn't fight. I let them think I was fading, irrelevant, easy to erase. Because betrayal is like a fire. It burns hottest right before it runs out of fuel. And I was already gathering water. Melissa thought she was clever. Daniel thought he was avoiding conflict. But I was watching. I was listening. I was waiting. And the day would come when their small betrayals would add up to something so big they couldn't hide it anymore. That's when silence would end, and truth would begin. After that Sunday dinner, Melissa and Daniel thought they had the upper hand. To them, I was nothing but an old man tolerated out of obligation. A shadow in the house, too tired or too weak to matter. They thought my silence meant they were winning. But the truth sat quietly in my study, untouched for years. I walked into that room the night after Melissa's insult still echoed in my ears. The smell of paper and leather wrapped around me, familiar and grounding. At the back of the drawer in my oak desk sat a folder I hadn't opened in a long time. I pulled it out, laid it flat on the desk, and opened it. Inside were documents, thick with signatures and embossed seals. The deed to the house. Bank statements. Contracts. Trust papers I had drawn up when my wife was still alive. Page after page, all bearing my name. Not Daniel's. Not Melissa's. My hands moved slowly over the papers, tracing the weight of them. These weren't just documents. They were proof. Proof that I wasn't what Melissa had painted me to be. Proof that the roof over their heads wasn't a gift from fortune or effort on their part. It was my sweat, my labor, my sacrifice. And the law still recognized it. Melissa's smirk at dinner had been fueled by ignorance. She thought time had made me irrelevant. But time, as my father once told me, only keeps score if you let it. I hadn't let go of my score. It was here in black ink, locked safely in my drawer. The next morning, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The lines on my face told a story of years carried heavy. Loss, labor, and sacrifice had carved themselves into my skin. But behind the weariness, I saw something else resolve. Melissa's words hadn't broken me. They had woken me. Over coffee at breakfast, I listened as Melissa rattled on about renovations. "We'll finally make this place our own," she said casually, with that arrogant smile of hers. My son sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, nodding along. She spoke as though the walls already belonged to her, as if the land was already theirs to mortgage. "And how do you plan to afford all that?" I asked, letting the question hang in the air. Her smile faltered just for a moment. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Oh, we'll figure it out," she said quickly. "Daniel's already talking to the bank. We'll make it happen." I set my mug down gently, watching her face. "Interesting," I said simply. Nothing more. The silence that followed unsettled her more than an argument ever could. She got up, heels clicking against the floor like hammers. Daniel muttered something about being late for work, and soon the door shut behind them. I leaned back in my chair. The seed of chaos had been planted. They didn't yet realize the bank would come back empty-handed. Without my signature, their plans had no ground to stand on. That afternoon, I made a call I hadn't made in years. Greg, an old friend from my army days, who had gone on to become a lawyer. His voice came through the line steady as ever. "It's been too long, old man," he said. "Not long enough," I muttered, though my tone softened quickly. "I need to ask you about property law." I laid it out for him, Melissa's insult, Daniel's silence, the talk of banks and renovations. When I finished, Greg let out a low whistle. "They've got some nerve," he said. "But they can't do a thing without you. The house is yours legally. If they're trying to mortgage it, they'll hit a wall. You've got more leverage than you think." Leverage. The word lodged in my mind like a spark. I hung up the phone with Greg and sat at my desk long after. The folder lay open in front of me, the papers spread like armor across the wood. Melissa and Daniel thought they held power because they were younger, louder, more modern. But power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly in a drawer, waiting for the right moment. That night, when I heard their muffled laughter upstairs, I wasn't angry anymore. I was steady, focused. They thought my silence meant surrender. But in reality, it had given me time to remember the truth. The house was mine, the land was mine, and the law was mine. Melissa had struck me with words meant to wound. Daniel had betrayed me with silence. But neither of them understood that the foundation of their comfort was still rooted in me. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to argue. I had leverage. And leverage speaks louder than any insult ever could. For weeks, Melissa and Daniel thought I was cornered. They mistook my quiet for defeat, my patience for weakness. But what they didn't realize was that silence doesn't mean standing alone. Even the strongest walls can crumble if you have the right allies at your side. The first to appear was Carl Henderson. We hadn't seen each other in years. We'd worked together at the mill, side by side in the clang of machines and the heat of sweat. He was younger then, sharp-eyed and quick with a laugh. Time had etched its lines into both of us, but when I saw him again, his eyes were just as sharp. It happened by chance. I was sitting at Jacobson Park, the old bench overlooking the pond where the water reflected the sky. Carl spotted me, and his voice cut through the years like they were nothing. "Don't tell me you finally retired that recliner and taken up walking instead." I laughed, a sound I hadn't felt in a while. We shook hands, and for a moment, I was pulled back to the days of camaraderie, when men worked hard, trusted each other, and didn't need to watch their backs at home. We talked of life, his kids, his grandkids, how the years had treated us. But when I mentioned Daniel, the conversation turned heavy. Carl's expression darkened. "I've been hearing things," he said carefully. "About your house. About Melissa." I stared out at the pond, the ripples scattering the reflection of the sky. "People talk," I said. "They do," Carl agreed, "and usually they're not wrong. Word is she's been telling folks you're, well, living off them. That you're dead weight." The words didn't sting the way they might have a week before. Not anymore. Now they confirmed what I already knew. Melissa wasn't just trying to poison Daniel against me. She was spinning her story out into the community, painting me as a burden so her version of events would stick. "She's mistaken," I said quietly. Carl chuckled. "She doesn't know you very well then. You've been carrying people your whole life. A man doesn't forget how to stand on his own." I looked at him, and for the first time in months, I felt something shift. Inside that house, I was invisible. But out here, people still remembered who I was. Not a burden. Not dead weight. A provider. A man who had built, endured, and sacrificed. Carl leaned closer. "If you ever need a hand, you call me. I mean it. I've got friends. Old friends. Folks who remember. Don't let them write you out of your own life." His words struck deeper than he realized. Friends who remember. That was what I had been missing. In my own home, my history was erased, my sacrifices ignored. But beyond those walls, there were still people who knew the truth. And Carl wasn't the only one. At the diner in town, I overheard whispers. Neighbors spoke softly but firmly. Melissa's pushing too hard, acting like the house is already hers. Another voice responded, but it's still his. Everyone knows it. The tide was shifting, slowly but surely. Melissa thought her words carried weight, but influence is fragile when built on lies. Truth, once it surfaces, spreads like wildfire. When I left the park that day, Carl's handshake still lingering in my mind, I realized something important. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The silence I had carried wasn't mine alone to bear. Others saw it too, and they were ready to stand with me when the time came. Melissa believed she was building a fortress with her whispers and manipulation. But what she didn't see was that allies were gathering, and each one added another crack in her walls. And soon, those walls would fall. It didn't take long for Melissa's carefully built story to start unraveling. Lies always do. At first, they hold strong, stitched together by arrogance and confidence. But the moment truth slips through a seam, the entire fabric begins to tear. The first crack came with the bank. Melissa had been so sure of herself, so certain that my silence was a blank check. She had already spoken of renovations, new countertops, tearing down walls, painting over the history of this house as if it were nothing more than her playground. She had spoken as though my name on the deed was just a formality. But the bank didn't see it that way. One evening, I watched her at the counter flipping through the day's mail. Bills, advertisements, then an envelope that made her pause. Her eyes lit up briefly before she masked it. A bank logo. She slipped it under her arm quickly, as though hiding treasure. Later that night, I saw Daniel at the table, his tie loosened, his face pale. He kept rubbing his temples as Melissa paced, whispering in sharp bursts. When she thought I couldn't hear, I caught fragments. They need more. Ownership not clear. He hasn't signed. The next day, her mask cracked further. I overheard her on the phone, her voice hushed but urgent. Yes, I know. We'll have his signature soon. Don't worry. He's old. He won't resist. Just keep the numbers ready. I stayed still, sipping my coffee as her words floated down the hallway. Each one was poison, but not to me anymore. To her. Because now, the truth was coming to light. The bank didn't trust her. Without me, without my signature, she was powerless. And word travels fast in a small town. At the diner, I overheard two neighbors talking while I nursed my coffee. Heard the bank shut them down. One said, "Guess the old man still holds the cards." I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. The truth was doing my work for me. The second crack came with the contractors. Melissa had spoken to them as if everything was already approved, already hers to control. But when ownership was questioned, they pulled out. The contracts vanished. The calls stopped. She stormed into the living room one afternoon, her face flushed with fury. "What have you been telling people?" she demanded. I folded my newspaper calmly. "The truth." Her jaw tightened. "You've poisoned the well. Now no one wants to work with us." I set the paper aside. "I don't need to ruin anything, Melissa." Lies collapse on their own. Her glare could have cut glass. But this time, Daniel didn't rush to defend her. He sat slumped in his chair, silent, staring at the floor. That silence wasn't allegiance anymore. It was exhaustion. The third crack was the community itself. Melissa had strutted through town, acting like the house was already hers, like I was nothing but an old relic hanging around too long. But people weren't blind. They remembered who I was, what I'd done, what I'd built. Neighbors who once nodded politely now looked at her with suspicion. Conversations hushed when she entered. Her smile grew thinner by the day, her confidence draining. And all the while, I remained silent, steady, watching, waiting, because silence wasn't just power anymore. It was fear. Not mine, theirs. Melissa and Daniel no longer looked at me like I was invisible. They looked at me like I was dangerous. Like every quiet sip of my coffee, every measured word, every steady glance carried weight they couldn't bear. The tide had turned, and they knew it. Melissa had mistaken silence for surrender. But now she was learning the truth. Silence, when paired with patience and truth, becomes the loudest sound of all. For a long time, Daniel's silence had been my deepest wound. Not Melissa's insults, not her arrogance, not even her schemes to claim what was mine, but his silence. The boy who once slipped notes into my lunchbox saying, "I love you, Dad," had grown into a man who couldn't raise his voice when his wife tore me down. But silence doesn't always stay the same. Sometimes, silence begins to fracture. It started in small ways. One evening, after Melissa had stormed into our dining room furious over another bank rejection, Daniel lingered behind. She disappeared into the kitchen, slamming cupboards loud enough to rattle the walls. Daniel sat at the table, his head in his hands. For a long while, he didn't move. Then he muttered under his breath, so quietly I almost missed it. "Everything's falling apart." I studied him carefully. He looked older than his years, his shoulders slumped, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. The pressure of Melissa's ambition had carved deep lines into him. He wasn't just tired. He was breaking. "Things fall apart," I said softly, "especially when they're built on lies." He flinched at the words but didn't argue. He didn't defend her. Instead, he just stared at the table, silent in a way that no longer felt like allegiance, but like surrender. Another night, I found him sitting alone in the darkened kitchen, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. Melissa had gone to bed already, her clipped footsteps still echoing in the hallway. Daniel sat slouched, his tie undone, his eyes distant. He looked at me, his voice low, almost broken. "She thinks you're orchestrating all of this," he said. I leaned against the doorway. "And what do you think?" His jaw tightened. His eyes flickered away. "I don't know what to think anymore." He took another slow drink. "I just know everything's slipping through my fingers." I stepped closer, my voice steady. "Things only slip away when you let go of them, son. You don't lose because someone else speaks louder. You lose when you stay quiet and let them speak for you." He didn't answer. His silence hung heavy, but for the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes. Doubt about Melissa. Doubt about himself. A few nights later, that doubt cracked open further. We sat on the porch together, the evening quiet except for the chirp of crickets. He sipped a beer slowly, his shoulders hunched. After a long silence, he asked, "Do you ever think about Mom? About what she'd say if she saw all this?" "Every day." The answer was on my lips before I even spoke it aloud. "She wouldn't want it like this," I told him. His eyes dropped to the ground. He nodded faintly, then whispered, "Sometimes I wonder if I made the wrong choice." The words hit me harder than Melissa's insult ever had. For the first time, Daniel admitted what I had known all along. His silence wasn't neutrality. It was weakness. It was fear. I leaned forward, my voice quiet but firm. "It's never too late to make the right choice." But he didn't reply. He finished his beer, stood slowly, and walked back inside to where Melissa's shadow still waited for him. That night, as I sat alone with the pocket watch ticking in my hand, I realized something. My sun was cracking, not toward me, not yet, but away from her. And cracks, once they appear, only spread. Melissa believed she had him completely. She believed his silence was her victory. But I could see it now. His silence was beginning to shift. It was no longer loyalty. It was the sound of a man breaking under the weight of his own choices. And when silence cracks, truth finds a way in. If silence was my weapon, then anger was Melissa's. But anger is a blunt instrument. It burns hot, it burns fast, and then it burns out. And as her plans began to crumble, her fury grew harder to hide. At first, she tried to mask it. Her smiles became brittle, her words sharper, her laughter forced. But anger doesn't like disguises. It slips out in slammed doors, in clipped footsteps, in the way her voice rose when she thought Daniel wasn't listening. One evening, she cornered me in the hallway. Her perfume was sharp, her eyes blazing. "I don't know what game you're playing," she hissed. "But you're making things harder than they need to be." I looked down at her, calm as ever. "Life is hard, Melissa. You'll get used to it." Her nostrils flared. "You think you can just sit there in that chair, clutching your papers and win? You don't know how this world works anymore. Times have changed." I let a faint smile cross my lips. "Don't I?" She spun on her heel, her footsteps echoing like hammers on the floor. Daniel avoided me that night, his silence stretched tight like a rope pulled too far. But Melissa couldn't hold back forever. Days later, she snapped. I was in the living room, sitting in my old recliner, the one she hated so much. She appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, voice sharp as a blade. "You think you're clever, don't you? Whispering with your old friends, running to the bank, making trips like we don't notice." I looked up slowly. "You notice plenty, Melissa. Just not enough." Her face flushed red. "You can't keep this up forever. Daniel and I are the future. You're just the past, clinging to walls that won't hold." For the first time in weeks, Daniel spoke sharply. "Melissa, that's enough." She turned on him, fury spilling from her eyes. "Don't you dare take his side." But he didn't answer. He looked at me instead, and for a fleeting moment, I saw it, a spark of the boy he used to be. A flicker of shame. A flicker of recognition. Then it was gone, swallowed by his silence once more. Melissa wasn't finished. The next day, a contractor pulled out of their project after learning the ownership of the house wasn't clear. Melissa stormed into the room, waving the rejection notice in her hand. "What have you been telling people?" she demanded. I folded the newspaper calmly. "The truth." Her jaw trembled. "You've poisoned everything. You're sabotaging us." I set the paper aside, my voice steady. "I don't need to sabotage anything. Lies collapse on their own." Daniel sat nearby, silent, his face pale. But this time, his silence wasn't agreement. It was exhaustion. Later that night, I overheard them arguing behind their closed door. Melissa's voice rose, sharp and desperate. "He won't hold out forever." Daniel's reply was lower, broken. "I hope you're right." Her fury burned hotter with every failure, but every outburst only weakened her. She was cracking, even if she didn't know it. Her power had always been built on confidence, on the illusion that she was in control. But illusions can't survive long when truth starts to shine through. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to fight. I only needed to wait. Because Melissa's fury wasn't strength, it was proof. Proof that the tide had turned. Proof that her grip was slipping. Proof that the fortress she had built with lies was crumbling, brick by brick. And when fury is all someone has left, it means they've already lost. Melissa's fury was loud. My silence was steady. But reckoning never comes with noise, it comes with truth. And when the truth finally arrived, it stripped away every illusion she had built. It began with Greg, my old friend, my lawyer, the man who knew the law as well as he knew me. He came to the house one afternoon, a thick folder in his hands. Melissa's eyes narrowed when she saw him standing in the doorway, his suit crisp, his expression calm. "It's time," Greg said simply. Melissa's voice wavered. "Time for what?" He laid the folder on the table, opening it with deliberate care. Page after page, stamped and notarized, bearing my name. "These are the protections your father put in place," he said, looking directly at Daniel. "The trust. The deeds. The filings. Legally, this house is his and untouchable. Nothing you've tried has changed that. Melissa's face drained of color. Daniel sank into a chair, his head falling into his hands. The room fell silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. I stood slowly, my voice calm, deliberate. I was silent because I was patient. I let you believe I was weak. I let you think you were winning. But now you see the truth. I am not a freeloader. I am the foundation you've been trying to erase. Melissa trembled, her lips parting. You can't just. I can, I interrupted. And I have. Her fury collapsed into something else then. Fear. Her smirk, her arrogance, her confidence, they all vanished. What stared back at me was desperation. Daniel finally lifted his eyes, regret heavy in his face. I'm sorry, Dad, he whispered. I looked at him, and my chest tightened. But I didn't answer. Sorry was too small a word and too late. I walked to my study and returned with an envelope. Placing it on the table, I slid it across the wood until it rested in front of Melissa. She stared at it with suspicion. What's this? The final piece of the puzzle, I said. Open it. Her fingers shook as she tore it open. Inside was a formal, notarized letter, plain and undeniable. It stated that the house, the land, and the trust had been secured irrevocably in my name, and that upon my passing the estate would not go to Daniel or Melissa, but to a charitable foundation supporting veterans' families. Her breath caught. You gave it away. To strangers? Not strangers, I corrected softly. To people who understand sacrifice. To people who know loyalty. To people who value what you've both forgotten. Daniel's face turned pale. His voice cracked. Dad, why? I looked at him, my words heavy with years of sacrifice and disappointment. Because you already made your choice. You let her voice drown out your own. You asked me to sign myself out of my life. You forgot who I am. And you forgot who you were raised to be. His shoulders shook. His lips trembled. I never meant for it to go this far. You meant enough, I said quietly. Melissa erupted. She shoved the letter back across the table, her voice shrill. You'd rather ruin us than help your own family? You're pathetic. I rose slowly, my shadow stretching across the floor. No, Melissa. I am finally free. And that is something you will never understand. Her rage faltered into silence. She sank back into her chair, her face hollow, her breath shallow. Daniel sat beside her, broken, staring at the letter as though it were a mirror reflecting a man he no longer recognized. I slipped the pocket watch back into my vest pocket. Its ticking filled the silence, steady and sure. You thought my silence meant weakness, I said, my voice calm final. But silence gave me time. Time to prepare, time to protect, time to take back what was mine. And now, time to let go. I walked to the front door, opened it wide. Cool air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. I turned back one last time. This is my house. You may live here, but you will never own it. Not now, not ever. Melissa's eyes widened, but no words came. Daniel bowed his head, unable to speak. Behind me, the door clicked shut with a sound like a verdict. The reckoning had come. Not with shouting, not with fists, but with the quiet weight of truth. The morning after Greg left the house in stunned silence, I woke earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, its light spilling across the kitchen floor in pale stripes. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter. Not because Melissa and Daniel were gone, they were still under that roof, but because the weight of their power over me had crumbled. Melissa emerged from the bedroom around noon. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale. The arrogance she once wore like armor had cracked, leaving only exhaustion. Daniel followed behind her, silent, shoulders sagging as though the years had finally caught up with him all at once. She tried, even then, to cling to control. She stood at the end of the table, her voice trembling but sharp. "We can fight this. We can take you to court. Prove you're unfit. We can still." "Stop!" The single word cut through her like a blade. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The word itself carried more weight than all her shouting. She froze, her mouth still open, but no sound came out. Daniel sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time, I saw him not as my betrayer, but as a man who had lost himself completely. I leaned forward, the pocket watch ticking in my palm. "You spent months calling me weak, a burden, a freeloader. You spun your stories to neighbors, to banks, even to yourself. But stories run out. And when they do, all that's left is the truth." Melissa's lips trembled. "And what truth is that?" I stood, holding the watch up to the light. Its silver surface was scratched, worn from years of use, but still steady. "The truth is that time always reveals who people are. And time has revealed you." Her eyes flickered with something I had never seen in her before. Not anger. Not arrogance. Fear. Daniel finally lifted his head, his voice breaking. "Dad, I never meant." I cut him off. "You meant enough, Daniel. You meant it when you sat in silence while she called me worthless in my own home. You meant it when you asked me to sign away everything I worked for. Silence is a choice, and you chose against me." His eyes filled with tears. He opened his mouth to apologize again, but the word had lost all meaning. It was too late. I turned, walking toward the front door. The air outside was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath me. Across the street, neighbors paused, their eyes following me. They didn't need explanations anymore. They already knew. Behind me, Melissa and Daniel sat in the ruins of their own making. They had built their plans on lies, and lies can't stand. I slipped the pocket watch back into my vest pocket. Its ticking no longer sounded like patience, it sounded like freedom. For months, they thought my silence was weakness. They mistook restraint for surrender. They thought they could erase me with whispers and paperwork. But silence gave me time. Time to prepare. Time to protect. Time to let them reveal themselves for what they truly were. And now, silence had given me victory. I closed my eyes, letting the sun warm my face. Justice hadn't come with shouting. It hadn't come with fists or rage. It had come quietly, steadily, with truth. My dignity was mine again. My freedom was mine again. And as the pocket watch ticked steadily at my side, I smiled, because silence, in the end, was never my weakness. It was my strength.